Today we're very happy to have James Mann here to speak with us. James is currently at Hopkins at the Foreign Policy Institute. He's the Foreign Policy Institute author in residence. Excuse me. James was a senior writer in residence at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, served as a staff writer for the Los Angeles Times, including positions as the Beijing bureau chief, the national security correspondent, and foreign affairs columnist. In addition, James was previously a staff writer for the New England Journal Courier, undoubtedly probably his first job as a journalist, right? The Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Baltimore Sun. Obviously couldn't hold a job. Sorry, just kidding. Just kidding. Might as well have fun here. His awards include National Press Club, Edwin M. Hood Award for Diplomatic Correspondence in 1993 and 1999, the Edward Wintoll Prize for Diplomatic Reporting in 1999, the New York Times Public Library Helen Bernstein Award for Best Book of the Year by a Journalist in 2000, and the Asia Pacific Award for the Best Book about Asia in 2000. He's currently a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and was formerly a guest scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and a fellow of the American Academy in Berlin. His most recent book, he's got a copy of it right there, and there are copies outside, The Rebellion of Ronald Reagan, A History of the End of the Cold War, which is what he's going to be speaking to us about today. And I should note, I believe James has agreed to sign books after his lecture today, so we look forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming out. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if the mic is on. Is it? Okay, good. I'm going to talk today about my book. I am finding as it comes out, and I'm not surprised, this is an effort to look dispassionately at Ronald Reagan and his role in the final years of the Cold War. And in some ways, it's a tough book for different parts of the political spectrum. It's really about what Reagan was like in reality, as opposed to the conventional views of him, both on the right and the left. It's a tough book, I'm finding, for conservative friends, because it concludes that Reagan's role in helping to bring the Cold War to a close was really primarily through his diplomacy with Mikhail Gorbachev, that it wasn't a matter of building up America's defenses or starting the Strategic Defense Initiative. It wasn't a matter that Reagan was a hawk. He built up American defenses and suddenly the Berlin Wall fell down. That wasn't, it wasn't nearly as simple as that. That wasn't what really happened. And it's a tough book for my liberal friends because it's about Reagan at all. Because just as Reagan is an unalloyed hero to the political right, he's the opposite. He's a figure to be shunned on the left. And really, what I do in most of my books is really to try and look again through archives, and in the case of someone like Reagan, where many of the members of his administration are still there to be interviewed, through interviews, and to really try and penetrate what we haven't known before, what the declassified archives show. And the focus of the book is on the political dynamics really during Reagan's second term in office, so 84, 85 to 88, the period that coincided with Mikhail Gorbachev's rise in the Soviet Union as Soviet leader. And the political dynamics of this period are quite unusual. They're now forgotten to many people because during this period, what you find as you look is that Reagan was increasingly at a distance from his early conservative supporters. This was a period when Reagan's old friends were increasingly unhappy with his policy towards the Soviet Union. So I try to describe what some of the columnists were saying. One of his regular critics, for example, is George Will, a figure known to many of you. And a representative column in 1988, George Will wrote, 4 years ago, many people considered Reagan a keeper of the Cold War flame. Time flies. During the same period, actually, the people that we think of now that are commonly called realists in Washington, that is, people who had been at odds with Reagan, whom Reagan had criticized during the 70s for détente with the Soviet Union, are actually to his right. They are criticizing Reagan for moving too fast with the Soviet Union. I'm referring to Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft. They, too, are criticizing Reagan and his Secretary of State, George Shultz, for moving too quickly with Gorbachev, for in their mind being deceived by Gorbachev. And so Richard Nixon, for example, goes to Moscow in 1986, and he meets Gorbachev for the first time. And just to give you a flavor of some of the documents, he writes down his impressions of Gorbachev. And he compares him to Leonid Brezhnev, whom Nixon had dealt with. Brezhnev uses a meat axe in his negotiations. Gorbachev uses a stiletto. But beyond the velvet glove he always wears, there's a steel fist. In essence, he's the most affable of all the Soviet leaders I've met, but at the same time, without question, the most formidable, because his goals are the same as theirs, and he will be more effective in attempting to achieve them. This was the common perception of Gorbachev in his early years, that he was just another Soviet leader, that he might look and act differently from other Soviet leaders, but that his policies towards the United States and towards the West would be essentially as those of his predecessors. And so actually, as the Reagan administration, as Reagan and George Shultz are proceeding through 4 summits with Gorbachev, actually his old conservative supporters and people like Nixon and Henry Kissinger are, for a time, allied in opposition to Ronald Reagan. It's a very curious, unusual political dynamic. During this period, the National Review, which was the conservative magazine, published, which during the 1970s had been hammering away at Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, published an article by them criticizing Reagan. And, Henry Kissinger goes off, he visits Moscow, and he comes back with the same view of Gorbachev, that they're going to be more assertive with respect to Soviet power. And these perceptions continue really until 1988, at the very end of Reagan's term. Reagan thinks they're wrong. His Secretary of State thinks they're wrong, that Gorbachev represents something new. And this argument within the administration behind the scenes continues until late 1988. There have been signs of change before that, but at the end of 1988, Gorbachev comes to New York, to the UN, and he announces that he's going to cut the size of the Soviet military by at least 500,000 troops, and he's going to withdraw divisions Soviet troops from Eastern Europe, 6 divisions. And at that point, within the government and among Reagan's critics, there is a recognition that he and his Secretary of State, George Shultz, have been right. So that was the strange politics of the period, and the goal of the book is to reconstruct what was happening, and to use archives and interviews to look at what was going on. And some of the material in the book is just new and at least an interesting material on what was going on during this period that we didn't know about. So I spent considerable time, a few chapters in the book, talking about Reagan's informal advisor and sometime intermediary with the Soviet Union, a woman named Suzanne Massie. Suzanne Massie was in no way a diplomat or a leading Soviet scholar. She was an author who had co-written a book called Nicholas and Alexandra about the Tsar and his wife. Many of you may have seen the movie at least, or read the book. She was traveling back and forth to the Soviet Union and was brought in 1984 for the first time, just to talk to Reagan about life in the Soviet Union. And Reagan just plain took a liking to her. She was someone who was able to give him just a sense of life in the Soviet Union, to give him stories, to give him anecdotes. Reagan was, after all, a political leader. He needed needed no help at all, to say the least, in giving a speech, but he needed stories. He needed anecdotes. He needed proverbs, and he was able to get some of these from Suzanne Massie. So one of the lines that many of you may remember from the period, because Ronald Reagan used it over and over again, trust but verify. That was it was a proverb. That was a line that he got from Suzanne Massie. So Reagan would get these, he would get CIA briefings that seemed dry and abstract and a little bit out of touch. And then, once in a while, and then Suzanne Massie, who really Reagan talked to about 20 times during this period, would give him a sense of ordinary life. And then it turned out that he sent a couple of messages to Moscow through her, and people in Moscow would send, who didn't want to send messages through the bureaucracy. They didn't want to send messages that went from the Soviet Foreign Ministry through the State Department and so on, would start sending messages to the White House through Suzanne Massie. This really hasn't been part of the histories. I found this in the archives, and I was going through and I started finding little notes where Suzanne Massie was brought in, and she'd carry a message saying, Gorbachev doesn't want to come to the United States right now. He thinks that you should come to Moscow first. And Reagan sent back, no, I really, please tell him I really, really do want to visit Moscow, but only after he comes to the United States. So this was, to say the least, highly irregular. George Shultz, the Secretary of State, objected to Suzanne, to this kind of private message carrying. He didn't just object to Suzanne Massie. He objected to anybody carrying private messages, and you can understand that from the standpoint of a Secretary of State. And Suzanne Massie got to the point by 1987 when Reagan's national security team, this shows up in the files, there was a secret campaign, keep this woman away from the president. She might be influencing him too much. Maybe Ronald Reagan is becoming a little bit more dovish, in their words. That wasn't quite right, because of Suzanne Massie. So that's one story in the book. Another story that I try and tell in the book is of the role of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan had a long, complicated relationship with one another. For many years in the 60s and early 70s, Nixon was politically the more senior figure, and Reagan supported him. By the late 70s and early 80s, really, Nixon is almost begging Ronald Reagan for attention because Nixon has resigned. And he's sending suggestions, he's sending notes, he's sending sort of flattering letters saying, that was a great speech, or I'm sorry Time magazine appointed Lech Walesa Man of the Year because you should be the Man of the Year. He's really kind of looking for a role for himself. And by the late 1980s, Richard Nixon actually emerges as to Ronald Reagan's right, as more hawkish than Reagan. And I tell the story of a meeting in 1987. No one had described before. I found Nixon's own notes of a meeting where he was snuck into Washington, to the White House, flown in by helicopter. He had not been back inside the White House other than for a downstairs state dinner since the day he left. He gets brought upstairs by Howard Baker and Frank Carlucci, that's Frank Carlucci of Princeton fame, and sat down, and Nixon looks around. He records this meeting. Reagan's really looking for his help. He wants Reagan. Nixon is supposed to support Reagan's diplomacy with Gorbachev. And just to give you a few sentences of that meeting, so Nixon hasn't been back at the White House since Watergate. Nixon's eyes scanned the living quarters, recording the changes with his characteristic blend of calculation and resentment. The Reagans, never known for parsimony, had given the place a sense of opulence. I would not have recognized it because of the luxurious furnishings and decorating, wrote Nixon in a memo for his own files a few hours later. As I looked up and down the hall, I'd estimate that at least $2 million, rather than the million reported in the press, had been expended for this purpose. By contrast, Nixon reflected to himself, his wife Pat had spent less money on redecoration and had concentrated on the downstairs public spaces of the White House, such as the dining rooms and the ballroom. Well, Reagan pushes hard to get Nixon's support, and Nixon won't give it. He doesn't like the diplomacy with Gorbachev. He doesn't like Reagan's Secretary of State, George Shultz. He thinks that Reagan is going astray. And the two old, sometimes friends, I call them the two leading anti-communist politicians of the war, because certainly they were the most successful anti-communist politicians of the war, of the Cold War, have a falling out. I tell the story in the book of how the Berlin Wall speech came about. The Berlin Wall speech, as many of you remember, is Reagan's speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate in 1987. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. And the question is, how did this speech come about? And what the archives and files show, it was the result of a battle that went on for about 3 months, in which Reagan's speechwriters drafted a speech for him to say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. And the State Department, the National Security Council, tried to get that line out of the speech over and over and over again. They really didn't want him to say it. What was the problem? The problem was not actually tear down that wall. Believe it or not, it's now forgotten. Reagan had said tear down that wall. He'd said it a year before. A bunch of American officials had said that the wall should come down. It's the two words, Mr. Gorbachev. The fact that this was directed, it wasn't just that the wall should come down in some passive sense. It was that this should be directed right to the leader of the Soviet Union. And the State Department on this one, George Shultz, the Secretary of State, objected. The whole State Department, the National Security Council, objected. Why? Because they were afraid that the speech would get Gorbachev in trouble at home. And they thought, that this would undermine Gorbachev's political position. It was a valid concern, and one that in other contexts Reagan took into account. But in this case, he judged, and he judged rightly, as we can see, that Gorbachev could simply slough this off. That it wasn't that Gorbachev could live with this. It wasn't going to really undermine his political position. The person that undermined, and Reagan may have realized this, it's hard, I can't really tell, was the leader of East Germany, Erich Honecker. Because I guess the way I phrase it, Honecker certainly wasn't about to tear down the wall, but he wanted to be asked. He would like to have been asked, because that would have been a symbol that it was his wall. When Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall," it was a reminder that really that it was Gorbachev's wall, in the sense that Honecker existed at the sufferance of the Soviet Union. So, more seriously, what are the political issues during this period? What are the issues that are being debated in Washington about Soviet policy? And the first and foremost is, what is Gorbachev all about? Is he just, as I said, is he just another face for the same old Soviet policies, or does he represent fundamental change? Is he going to change things? And on that, the divide is that Reagan treats him as something, as a person significantly different from other Soviet leaders. And so does his Secretary of State, George Shultz, and many other people in Washington argue that that's not correct. Inside the government, inside the Reagan administration, the leading critic of the idea that Gorbachev represented something new was a guy at the Central Intelligence Agency, the leading CIA expert on Soviet affairs, a very thoughtful guy by the name of Bob Gates. That would be the current Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, who has since admitted that he was wrong, or that he realized it took a couple of years to understand Gorbachev's significance. But during this period that I'm writing about, Gates and Reagan and Shultz have dramatically different views, and they're arguing with each other. And George Shultz, Secretary of State, tries to get Gates fired at one point. And Gates, he just plain disagrees. That Gates ends up outlasting them, in the sense that at the end of 1988, Reagan and Shultz leave office, and Gates stays on, and he, serves in the George H.W. Bush administration. But on Soviet policy during this period, they are bitter enemies. The other issue in Washington at the time is what to do about nuclear weapons. Because starting in 1986, at one of the 4 summits, the most important one, the Reykjavik summit in Iceland, Reagan and Gorbachev begin to talk about dramatically cutting back on, or even abolishing, nuclear weapons, and cutting back on the missiles that deliver those weapons. And they don't reach an agreement. This is something that comes up in their discussions. They don't reach a deal. Reagan leaves the summit very upset, but he comes home and he begins asking the Pentagon, Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Council, what can we do to cut back on missiles and nuclear weapons? And this shows up in the archives. You can see this again and again, and they're quite upset about this. I think it's going to undermine American military position in Europe. And so during this period, again, contrary to all image and stereotypes, Reagan is pushing for cutbacks in nuclear weapons and against resistance in Washington. That's the other submerged argument of the period. So Reagan really, despite his image today is quite similar to the image that people had of him in the early 80s. In fact, his policies during the second term are quite different. And in fact, publicly during this term, I mean, you do have people like George Will writing that Reagan has changed. And in fact, a look at the policies and the archives show that he has changed from the early 80s. So the question is why? And there are a bunch of arguments. I take a look at them, but really, in my mind, the change comes in about 1983. 1983 is the peak of tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets, and the peak of tensions between Reagan and the Soviet leadership. And in 1983, you get a series of incidents. The Soviets shoot down a Korean airliner. At the end of 1983, there is a strange episode in which the United States and its NATO allies stage military exercises. They were called the Able Archer exercises. They were meant as military exercises. And a spy working for the West inside the Soviet leadership reports that the Soviets think they're about to be attacked. In fact, this is a guy who's working for British intelligence. He comes to them quite upset. Says, I've been spying for you, but here I thought I was working in the interests of world peace, and you're trying to launch a nuclear attack, or it wasn't. We weren't sure about a nuclear attack, but you're trying to attack. And Reagan gets upset at this misunderstanding and says, how could they really believe that we're about to attack the Soviet Union? And it's the latest of a series of episodes over a period of months in 1983 in which you get the question of whether there could be a misunderstanding between the Soviet Union and the United States that might actually lead to an unintentional conflict. And really, Reagan begins to change his rhetoric at early 1984. He gives a speech that's markedly different in tone, and people in 1984 understandably thought that this speech was political rhetoric. Reagan was running for re-election, and I think that was a fair interpretation at the time. But he, by 1985, after being reelected, Reagan kind of continues along the same vein. Now, there are two or three arguments that get put forward for why Reagan changed that I think don't work. One is that he did whatever Nancy Reagan said, and that's, I would say 80-90% true, but 10%, Nancy Reagan didn't always get her way. Clearly, with her husband, there were several episodes where she wanted him to do something he didn't do, or he did something she didn't want him to do. So I don't think this can be all blamed on Nancy Reagan. Another explanation put forward is that the Iran-Contra scandal at the end of 1986, which really threatened Reagan's presidency. It's hard for us to imagine now what the White House was like in early 1987 when you had the National Security Advisor had resigned, the White House Chief of Staff was replaced, the CIA Director was in the hospital, previous National Security Advisor had attempted to commit suicide. It was really, the White House was really in chaos. And then Reagan's presidency revived over the next 2 years, and one of the interpretations is that everything Reagan did in those final 2 years was an effort to kind of reestablish his presidency. And that, that argument, it may be true in general, but it doesn't work for these Soviet policies, because they began before the Iran-Contra episode. They began in 85 and 1986. The summit I mentioned in Reykjavik, where Reagan and Gorbachev talk about eliminating nuclear weapons, has already taken place about a month or two before Iran-Contra breaks. So I don't think it can all be written off to Iran-Contra. A couple of other things. The overall judgment of Reagan. What was he like? And during these summits with Gorbachev, he was very hard for Gorbachev to deal with. Gorbachev has since written sincerely about how much he admired Reagan, and he did. And Gorbachev's own aides have said that he came back from these summits. After the first summit, he came back storming that Reagan was a Neanderthal. After the second summit, he said Reagan is someone I think we can deal with. And that's the overall judgment. Actually, at the time, Gorbachev found, as everyone found, that Reagan was hard to have a meeting with because he was brilliant at deflecting other people. People would come in with an agenda, a long list of items that they wanted to talk about, and Reagan would tell jokes. And it was something he enjoyed doing. It also really served the purposes of putting other people sort of off their agenda. And he had an endless supply of anti-communist jokes. So a communist leader would come in and sit down, and Reagan would say, what are the 4 things wrong with Soviet agriculture? And so, I don't know. And he would say, spring, summer, fall, and winter. Really, it was very hard for other people to deal with him. And Gorbachev was really a classic debater. And I talked to the note takers who sat in on the one-on-one meetings between Reagan and Gorbachev. And they said Gorbachev would do something that he did in larger meetings. He would make some point that he thought was brilliant, and who knows, maybe it was. He would look around the room and look for other people to be nodding in agreement, and then he'd just be left there with Reagan, who would tell another joke, and it was very frustrating for Gorbachev. The overall judgment of Reagan, to me, they're all almost mirror images. The left and right-wing characterizations of Reagan. The left-wing characterization is that he was simply a dunce, and the right-wing is that he was a man of simple virtues. And I actually, my own view after looking at this for several years is that this was a very canny guy who had very, very shrewd instincts. It's really not a surprise. This is, when you think about it, this is the first guy. If in 1979 or 80 or 81, the idea that a president would succeed in having a 2-term presidency, something we take for granted again now after Clinton and Bush, was almost unthinkable then. The conventional wisdom at the time was that it was just too hard, that the trends were that it was hard to win re-election. This was during this period really from the end of World War II until the 1980s. You had one president who'd won re-election, who had a full 2-term, full 2-term presidency, and that was Eisenhower, war hero. So Reagan, you didn't see it. He didn't tell you his motivations. He didn't tell you his strategy. It seemed like a lot of patter. I found that he was extremely shrewd. And some of the things he did were, I guess, unusual would be the polite word for it. The treaty that he signed with Gorbachev during a visit to Washington by Gorbachev in 1987. Reagan insisted that it be signed at, I believe the time was 1:45 p.m. in the afternoon, and people kept trying to talk him out of it because the schedule was such that they wanted him to do something else at 1:45, and he insisted it had to be 1:45. And it turned out that that was the time that Nancy Reagan's astrologer had told her this needed to be signed, and I don't mean to pass it off on Nancy Reagan because the president went along too. So some of the things were highly unusual. He had the misperception that Gorbachev was religious, and so I describe in the book. Some of you may have seen this was excerpted in the Wall Street Journal. The time at the 1988 summit when Reagan left alone with Gorbachev in one of these one-on-one meetings, begins to talk to him about religious belief, talk to him in general. Gorbachev tries to switch the subject to space, and he says, no, I'm talking about something much further out than space, and then says, says, my own son, Ron Reagan Jr., is an atheist, and I try to tell him, whenever he has a really good meal, was there a cook? And really gives him some of his arguments about the existence of God. This in the end went nowhere. There was no sign then, and there's no sign today that Gorbachev was religious. I think I got this right, and I know I got this right because Gorbachev was just in this country and said that my book had gotten the underlying dynamics right. But what Reagan did get right was the central point. He did get right that for foreign policy, Gorbachev really did represent something new and different. And his own early conservative supporters who objected, some of them have been honest enough to admit now that they were wrong and that Reagan did get it right, and it counted. It counted, and this was important because Gorbachev needed help, needed recognition, needed from the West, from the United States, in order to build up his own political position in Moscow. Gorbachev has admitted this. He really needed international triumphs to kind of stave off the conservative opposition of his own at home. And he got it from Reagan, and Reagan seemed to understand this. To come to the period in 1989, when did the Cold War end? Depending on how you count it, if you want to put it on a single day, it's the day, the night that the Berlin Wall comes down. That's November 9th, 1989. Or if you want to take it more broadly, it ended throughout the year of 1989 when one government after another, then there are a series of unfolding changes in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, then the Berlin Wall comes down, and then Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria and Romania. And the question is, so I think, everyone agrees that's really when the Cold War ended. And it ended because Gorbachev decided not to intervene. And that's what made 1989 different from 1967, for example, when the Soviets sent troops into Czechoslovakia, or several other times. And the question is, unless we think that was automatic, that by then, or that was inevitable. It wasn't. That took diplomacy, and it took leadership by Gorbachev. It was a decision that was not inevitable, that Gorbachev would simply let that happen. I tell the story in the book of the East German leader whom I interviewed, Egon Krenz. When I lived in Berlin, I spoke with him, a guy who's now so down and out that I had to get an interview. I had to pay 20 or 30 euros for his book. And he told the story of that night, at the end of the Cold War, when the wall came down as a result of a series of misunderstandings. The East German leaders thought they were going to open up the wall in a very controlled way on November 10th. They put out a press release that said, the wall will be opened for visits, if you file the right papers and so on. They had their written statement. They handed it to a guy who hadn't read the statement, and it said at the top, for release on November 10th. This was the night of November 9th, 1989. And at the bottom, it said, this will take place immediately, meaning once this press release comes out on November 10th, it will then take effect immediately. The guy hadn't read it. He goes out to the press. He kind of reads the outline, and someone asks, when will this take place? And he looks at the bottom, and it says it'll take place immediately. Whereupon, and this is on television in East Germany, and people start streaming across the wall. It was all. This was how messed up and incompetent the East German leadership was. At that point, it was in chaos, and the border guards don't know what to do, and they can't reach Krenz for hours, and people keep on going through the wall. And Krenz decides that he can't authorize border guards to shoot. The next morning, the Soviet ambassador in East Berlin, that is the Soviet ambassador to East Germany, calls Krenz and says, what on earth have you done here? Why is this happening? Please send a telegram, there were telegrams in those days, to Moscow explaining yourself. And Krenz does this. And 2 hours later, and he's quite, he's angry and he's threatening, and, we demand an explanation immediately. And 2 hours later, he calls back and he says, Comrade Krenz, in the name of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, we understand and we congratulate you. It gives you a sense that, this wasn't automatic, that the Soviets were trying to figure out, then and even for a little bit after that, what they should do about what was happening in East Germany. So the question is, what was on Gorbachev's mind? And I would submit to you that it wasn't just, oh my gosh, the United States has a Star Wars program, or it wasn't just, in the early 80s they built up their defenses. It was really that he wanted an entirely new relationship with the West, the one that he'd been working on for about 3 or 4 years that he needed, and thought he could get. And sure, defense was one factor in there, but the idea that Reagan won the Cold War by simply building up American defenses really doesn't explain things for me, because there could have been, with that military situation, a long stalemate for years. There could have been some kind of violent upheaval. Really, it was remarkable. And so I will now read to you the last paragraph of the book, because it does represent the conclusion. In the end, the Cold War sputtered out without any large-scale violent upheavals or explosions. It was not inevitable that the climax should have been so anticlimactic. Unquestionably, Gorbachev played the leading role in bringing the 4-decade-old conflict to a close. Yet Reagan, overcoming considerable opposition of his own at home, played a crucial role by buttressing Gorbachev's political position. It was in this sense that Ronald Reagan helped to ensure the Cold War ended in the tranquil fashion that it did. Reagan didn't win the Cold War. Gorbachev abandoned it. By recognizing Gorbachev's significance when many others in the United States did not, Reagan helped to create the climate in which the Cold War could end. Thank you. I hope you try the book. The first 5 or 6 people who get the book, my wife, who is so talented, has made bookmarks, and at least there'll be a few for that show the book on it for some of those who buy the book. Thank you. I'd be delighted to take your questions. Yeah.
What evidence might there be that Reagan's Alzheimer's was showing some impact on his judgment at this time?
Let me make several points on it. I mean, first, it's easy or considerably easier now, of course, to say because Reagan had Alzheimer's that maybe he had it in those last years. The first point to make is that Reagan began going to the Mayo Clinic in the early 90s. And he did one visit where they couldn't diagnose Alzheimer's, and then another where they did, and that's when he wrote his letter. So in formal medical terms, no, he didn't have Alzheimer's. Was he beginning to fade? Yes, sometimes. So what I find in the book is that by his last year, he is becoming increasingly detached from day-to-day events. I'm sorry, thank you very much. His last year as president in 1988. So I interviewed Colin Powell for the book, who said that he and others said, when we, day in and day out, we would meet at the White House. Powell was the National Security Advisor working at the White House with George Shultz and Frank Carlucci, the Secretaries of State and Defense, at 7:30 or 8 in the morning and try and make most decisions on our own. And they did try and by this time, they all got along. That hadn't been true for most of Reagan's presidency. You usually had the Secretary of State and Defense fighting each other. They got along, they made most decisions, and then he said, when we needed something from Reagan, we would bring it to him, and he would make the decision. And sometimes he would settle disputes. There was a bitter argument over what to do about Noriega in Panama, for example, where George Bush, the vice president, wanted to really take a tough line on Noriega, and Reagan said no. So you can see him when he's needed being the same as he was, but day in and day out, he really is detached. There was one curious item that I found in the archives that I could not take any further, and that was this. In December of 1988, George Bush Sr. has been elected president. The Reagans are preparing to leave the White House to go back to California. And the calendars and the schedules show one day where there are a series of meetings about their move. And one of them involves real estate and property, I think, and Reagan's going to open an office in Century City. And one of them is about getting a family doctor, a physician, obviously the White House physician who's been Reagan's doctor, he can't use anymore. And then one other meeting, maybe the next meeting that day, is with the Alzheimer's Foundation. And I found this curious. I mean, why then? Officially this was a meeting that was about, I think charity or promotion for, but why then? And that, I do wonder whether the Reagans wondered at that point, or were worried about Alzheimer's. But the short answer officially was the Mayo Clinic was watching, and at one point in the early 90s doesn't diagnose him with Alzheimer's, and then does. Yeah.
I think early in his administration, they called it an evil empire.
Right.
Did he believe it then when he said that it was an evil empire? And second, did he eventually maybe change his view of that during maybe the conversion period that you're talking about?
Answer in reverse order. Did he change his view? Yes. During the summit, when he went to Moscow in the summit in 1988, he was asked specifically, "Do you still think this is an evil empire?" And he said, "No, that was another time, another era." And in fact, those words, which were right in Red Square, in front of St. Basil's, were in many ways the main event of the summit. It was both for coverage, and it was of tremendous importance to Gorbachev and Soviet leaders, and the American officials thought that was as important as any specific negotiation. First question is it's harder to be that definitive. Did he mean it? He gave, I think he probably did mean it. He chose to give that speech. It was the spring of 1983 to the National Association of Evangelicals at their convention. There was it was designed in part to oppose the nuclear freeze movement. Reagan, in that period, and this is, again, why I think he changed, in that period, Reagan is strongly opposed to the nuclear freeze movement, and he's looking for support and help from the evangelical community, and therefore gives that speech. But, I think that generally reflected his views of the early 80s.
I thought that the threat of a United States military buildup was what worried the Soviet Union, because their own economic situation at that time was pretty bad, and that might have led to Gorbachev's interest in making some kind of peace. But I gather that you don't think that was.
I think Gorbachev was worried about that, but that's to me is not enough to cause him to abandon the leadership, East European leaderships. Yes, some people take that a step further and say that's why Gorbachev was appointed. That in some way his appointment was meant to be a concession that the Soviets couldn't compete with the United. They had to find a way to compete with the United States, and that part doesn't make sense. I mean, Gorbachev was appointed. There's one reason above all he was appointed. He was in his 50s and he was healthy. There were 3 Soviet leaders who died between in 1982. 3 and 4, and they just wanted someone who was vigorous and was going to be on the job. But so yes, the Soviets were desperately worried about their economy, but that wasn't enough to cause them to abandon the Cold War, I don't think.
Professor Mann, didn't Bill Casey and the CIA play a major role in the downfall of the Soviet Union by their influence in supplying the Taliban with Stinger missiles in Afghanistan, thereby continually draining the Soviet Union militarily, economically, and psychologically in that quagmire that they were in? And wasn't that a major contribution to the downfall of the Soviet Union?
Afghanistan was really important. It caused the Soviets to pull back, but again, it's quite a step to go from there to saying we're going to abandon the leaders in Eastern Europe. Bill Casey was probably in the lead of people who wanted to challenge the Soviets economically, and he was a dominant influence in it during the first term, and then began to lose influence. I mean, Casey, by 1984, in 84 and 85, fails. He wants to replace George Shultz as Secretary of State with Gene Kirkpatrick, and tries to do that, and Reagan won't go along. He helps to push through an internal executive order in 1983 saying the U.S. will challenge the Soviets economically. And then Reagan at the end says, but we will do nothing that stands in the way of high-level dialogue with the Soviet Union. So the policy was never quite what Casey thought it was. Actually, on the specifically the Stinger, Afghanistan as a whole was important, and the Stingers played a role. Oddly enough, the Stinger missiles is not something that came directly from Casey. It was really, there was a small group of people, including some intelligence people, who were pushing for Stinger missiles. And oddly enough, some of the leading hawks in the administration, like Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, were afraid to give, were very nervous about and for a while opposed giving out the Stinger missiles. Yeah, that's exactly right. And we're nervous about, it wasn't the Taliban, it was the Mujahideen, but they were nervous about what that was going to mean. Yeah.
The polemics and the discussion of abortion seem to overcome almost every other topic today, and yet when you go back and you look at our political history, that subject never came up before 1980, or at least not to any significant degree. Do you see anything in your work, James, that said, was this a political strategy that was used to get the so-called Reagan Democrats on board? How did this come into our political scene?
You're taking me outside my real field of expertise. How that came in, I don't know. I mean, again, this book is about Reagan and the Cold War, and I'm not sure I can answer. Certainly, Reagan was the first presidential candidate, first major candidate for whom abortion was a major issue. On the other hand, during his presidency, I think the anti-abortion movement was disappointed with him. So it was another example of something where his rhetoric and his actual policies were not quite in line with one another. Sorry.
Last year, during the situation between the Soviet Union and Georgia, and also the Bush administration's push for a missile defense shield, there was considerable talk in this country that maybe the Cold War would be reestablished. Do you see that as just talk, or do you see that in long term?
I think when people say that, they're confusing tensions with Russia with the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War was on such a different order than what happened last year, and Russia is in such a different position than the Soviet Union was then. I mean, you don't have the empire that you had before. I mean, you get Putin and friends talking about envisioning, maybe dreaming, reestablishing something in that direction. But really, if you look back at where the Soviet Union was then compared to today, it's just hard to compare. And if you look at the level of tensions over 40 years in the Cold War compared to just the tensions over Georgia, it's just what happened last year is of a vastly lesser order. Yeah.
Very brief anecdote about the coming down of the Cold War and East Germany and how it functioned. One night it was announced the U-Bahn takes a loop through East Berlin. All those stations were sealed off, so the West Berliners could go through there without being able to get out. The the next morning, every one of those stations was open, clean, and functioning. One of my daughters was in Berlin at the time.
That's nice. Any other questions? Yes.
Instead of seeing that Reagan started off as a hardliner and then changed to a softer approach, do you see any possibility that that was his plan all along? And especially when he saw the Gorbachev as possibly somebody to deal with as opposed to previous leaders.
Well, first of all, there are signs during his first term. Again, I mentioned this point where there is an executive order being drafted to challenge the Soviet Union, and at the last minute, Reagan says, "I don't want anything I want to note here that there's going to be nothing that stands in the way of high-level dialogue." So there are some signs that Reagan was thinking about negotiations and the possibility of negotiations early. The other thing, yes, Gorbachev does change. The advent of Gorbachev changes Reagan, and you can look at it in one way as consistent with early Reagan, which is that the standard view of the Soviet Union from the 40s, from people like Richard Nixon, is that the Cold War is a matter of geopolitics. That this is a battle over who has the most tanks, the most missiles, and so on. And, many people who think that, who believe that. Reagan really had kind of a different view of the Cold War, and his views had their origins in the 40s when he's in Hollywood and there are battles over communists in unions, and his view really goes beyond geopolitics to communists are bad, are evil people. And as he, after a couple years as president, when he sees that Gorbachev is someone he can deal with. A year or two before Gorbachev comes to power, the Soviet ambassador Dobrynin in Washington is brought to meet with Reagan for the first time, and Reagan asks afterwards, is he really a communist? Because his view of communist leaders was captured by a line he used at his first press conference in 1981. They all lie and cheat and steal. So that really, that was his view. And he begins to see Gorbachev as someone he can deal with, but he also doesn't see the Cold War as just a permanent, unending conflict of who has the most tanks. He sees it as a battle of ideas, and his Secretary of State, Schultz, sees it as an economic conflict. So it isn't just a matter of counting up who has a strategic advantage in one country or another. And in that sense, I suppose you could say that Reagan's underlying views are, they change, but his underlying views are consistent because he's never seen the Cold War as just counting up, who has the most military pieces.
What was your findings relative to Gorbachev's fall from favor over there?
In 1991?
Yes.
Yeah. I will say you won't find that in the book ends in 89, and it's in 91. Finally, what we sometimes call the power ministries in the Soviet Union, the KGB, the Interior Ministry, the Ministry of Defense, have finally had enough of Gorbachev. He's beginning to move towards changing the Soviet system, the relationship of the central government and the republics, and so they move against him. in this attempted coup. And I know there are interpretations that really this whole attempted coup was somehow a fraud or something. It was, it was a failed coup, but it was a genuine attempt at a coup. But at that point, things have in the Soviet Union have changed so much that they just can't pull it off. I'm not. Am I answering your question? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all. I'd be delighted to.